At the Christmas dinner table, my son barked, "Dad, the family has decided we don't need you anymore." I nodded and pulled out some documents. "Then this is yours." When he saw the papers, he screamed. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those painfully ordinary Tuesdays in late November, when the sky is the color of dishwater and the air has that first real bite of winter. I remember the day with a clarity that feels almost artificial now, like a scene from a movie that's been color-corrected to look bleak. I was at my desk, the one I'd had for 15 years, in the corner office of the architectural firm I'd built from the ground up. The view overlooked a small park, and the trees were skeletal, their bare branches scratching at the gray sky. My office was my sanctuary. It smelled of freshly brewed coffee, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of the lemon polish the cleaning crew used. The chair I sat in was worn leather, molded perfectly to my back after thousands of hours spent hunched over blueprints and contracts. This office, this company, it was all for them, for Sarah and Jake. Every long night, every missed weekend, every ounce of pressure was a brick I laid in the foundation of their comfort, their security. The phone on my desk buzzed, a soft, polite sound that cut through the low hum of my computer. It was Sarah. Her voice was bright, a little breathless, the way it always was when she was caught up in her social whirlwind. "Hey, honey," she chirped. "I'm so sorry to do this to you, but could you possibly be a hero and pick me up tonight?" I swiveled in my chair, looking at the framed photo on my desk. It was from our trip to the Grand Canyon 5 years ago. Sarah was laughing, her hair whipping around her face in the wind. Jake, then a cocky 17, stood beside her with a grudging smile, trying to look too cool for a family photo. I was standing behind them, my arms wrapped around them both. We looked happy. We were happy, I thought. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice betraying a little of the weariness I felt. We had a big proposal due Friday, and I'd been planning on working late. "I thought you were taking your car." I know," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "But Sharon insisted we share a ride to the city for the Children's Foundation Gala Planning Committee dinner. You know how she gets. And now her driver has a family emergency, and a taxi back to the suburbs at this hour will cost a fortune. Plus, it's just safer if you come get me. Please?" The mention of the Children's Foundation was her usual trump card. Sarah had poured her heart into that charity for the last decade. She was the co-chair of the fundraising committee, a role she took very seriously. It gave her purpose, she said, now that Jake was grown and out of the house, mostly. He was 22, had finished a business degree at the state university, a degree I'd paid for in full, and was now in a vaguely defined transitional period, which meant he lived in our guest house, drove a car I'd bought him, and was exploring his options. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, already mentally rearranging my evening. The proposal could wait. My family came first. It was the mantra I'd lived by for over 20 years. "Where are you, and what time?" She gave me the name of a restaurant downtown, a chic, upscale place called Aria. "We should be wrapping up around 9:30. Can you just text me when you're nearby? I don't want to keep you waiting." "No problem. See you then. Love you." "Love you too, my hero," she cooed and hung up. I leaned back in my chair, the leather groaning in protest. A hero. That's what she called me. The provider, the protector, the reliable rock. I'd always worn the title with pride. I wasn't a flashy man. I didn't need fancy cars or expensive watches. My satisfaction came from seeing my family thrive. The beautiful house in the quiet, tree-lined suburb, Sarah's designer clothes for her charity events, Jake's top-of-the-line laptop. Those were my trophies. They were the physical proof that my hard work meant something. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of revisions and phone calls. By 7 o'clock, my eyes were burning from staring at the screen. I decided to head out early, maybe grab a bite to eat myself before heading downtown to get Sarah. The thought of a quiet meal alone was appealing. Life at home had become noisy, in a way. Not loud, but full of a kind of static. Sarah was always on the phone, organizing, planning, delegating. When Jake was home, the television was always blaring, or he'd be on the phone with his friends, his voice full of a brittle, youthful arrogance that grated on my nerves more than I cared to admit. The quiet of my car, the solitude of a small diner, that was my peace. I drove out of the city, the traffic thinning as I hit the familiar roads leading to our neighborhood. Our house was a custom build I had designed myself nearly 15 years ago. A modern take on a classic colonial, with big windows and a wide, welcoming porch. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Sarah's car, a pristine white SUV, parked in its usual spot in the garage. I frowned. She'd said she'd shared a ride with Sharon. Why was her car here? A small, cold knot formed in my stomach. It was probably nothing. Maybe Sharon had picked her up from our house. That made sense. Yes, that had to be it. I was tired, overthinking things. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the feeling. I was the rock. Rocks don't get unsettled by little inconsistencies. I went inside. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of the potpourri Sarah kept in a bowl in the foyer. It smelled of cinnamon and dried oranges, a scent I usually associated with warmth and comfort. Tonight, it just smelled cloying, artificial. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Everything was perfect. The cream-colored sofas were plumped, the design magazines fanned out just so on the glass coffee table. It was a beautiful room, a room from a magazine. Sometimes I felt like we were just actors on a set that I had built. I went up to our bedroom. On the bed, laid out carefully, was the dress Sarah had planned to wear. It was a simple, elegant black dress. Next to it were the shoes and the clutch she was going to use. Nothing had been touched. She hadn't gone to any gala planning dinner. Or if she had, she hadn't left from home. The cold knot in my stomach tightened into a fist. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the untouched clothes on the bed. The silence of the house pressed in on me. It wasn't a peaceful silence anymore. It was heavy, full of unasked questions. Why would she lie about something so simple? Taking a ride with a friend. It was such a small, pointless deception. I walked back downstairs, my mind racing, trying to piece together an explanation that made sense. Maybe she'd had a change of plans. Maybe the meeting was moved, or she'd had to go somewhere else first. She would have called, though. She always called. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Sarah. Running a little late. Maybe closer to 10 now. This committee is so chatty. See you soon. XOXO. I stared at the message, at the cheerful little winky face emoji. It felt like a deliberate taunt. She was lying. I didn't know why or about what exactly. But the lie was as clear and solid as the phone in my hand. For the first time in 23 years of marriage, I felt a chasm open up between us. I was standing on one side, and she was on the other, waving cheerfully from across a void I never even knew existed. My initial plan to grab a quiet dinner was gone. A different kind of plan began to form, a cold and unfamiliar one. I wasn't going to text her when I was nearby. I wasn't going to wait for her to come out to the curb. I was going to go to Aria. I was going to go early. And I was going to see for myself what kind of committee dinner she was at. I felt a tremor of fear, a deep-seated dread of what I might find. But underneath the fear was something else, something harder and sharper, the need to know the truth. The rock was starting to crack, and I had to see how deep the fissure went. I walked out of the house, leaving the lights off, and drove back toward the city, toward a restaurant I'd never been to, and a truth I was terrified to discover. The drive downtown felt different this time. The familiar streets seemed alien, the city lights cold and sharp. Every traffic light felt like a deliberate pause, forcing me to sit with the roiling unease in my gut. My mind was a frantic mess, cycling through possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Maybe it was a surprise party for me? No, my birthday was months away. A secret business venture she was afraid to tell me about? Unlikely. Sarah handled the home, I handled the business. That was our pact. The simplest explanation was the one I was most afraid of, the one my mind kept shying away from like a horse from a flame. I parked the car in a public garage a block away from Aria. It was just past 8:30. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was a fool who was about to embarrass himself and his wife. I could just sit here, wait until 10, and pretend I hadn't noticed the car in the garage or the untouched dress on the bed. I could preserve the comfortable fiction of our lives. For a moment, I was tempted. The thought of returning to the status quo, to the life I understood, was powerfully seductive. But the lie, small as it was, had been like a chemical dropped into our placid life, turning everything cloudy. I couldn't unsee it. I got out of the car and started walking. The air was cold, and I shoved my hands in my pockets, hunching my shoulders against the wind. Aria was on a corner, its large plate glass windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It was exactly the kind of place Sarah loved. Elegant, exclusive, expensive. A place to see and be seen. Through the window, I could see tables draped in white linen, occupied by well-dressed people laughing and talking. My heart was pounding, a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I positioned myself across the street, partially hidden by the awning of a closed bookstore. From here, I had a clear view of most of the dining room. I scanned the faces, my eyes darting from table to table. I didn't see her. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees weak. I was wrong. I was a suspicious, middle-aged fool. She wasn't here. Maybe the meeting had moved, and she'd just forgotten to tell me the new location. But then I saw her. She wasn't at a large table with a committee of chattering women. She was at a small, secluded table in a corner, partially obscured by a large potted plant. A table for two, and she wasn't alone. He was sitting across from her, his back mostly to the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see his posture. He was leaning forward, his attention entirely on her. He had dark hair, wore an expensive-looking suit. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, and Sarah laughed. It wasn't her polite social laugh. It was a deep, genuine laugh, the one I hadn't heard in years, the one that used to be just for me. She reached across the table and touched his hand. It was a fleeting gesture, but it was intimate, possessive even. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the city, the traffic, the distant sirens, faded into a dull roar. All I could see was that table, that gesture. It was like watching a silent film, a tragedy in which I was the only audience member. I stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, for what felt like an eternity. I watched him pour her a glass of water from a fancy bottle. I watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous, girlish gesture I knew well. I watched them exist in a bubble of shared intimacy that did not include me. Who was he? My mind scrambled for a name, a face, one of her charity contacts, a friend's husband. The name Richard floated up from some forgotten conversation. Richard Maxwell, a wealthy developer who had made a huge donation to the Children's Foundation last year. Sarah had mentioned him a few times. "He's so charming," she'd said, "and so generous." I had pictured an older, portly man, a philanthropist in his twilight years. The man at the table was not old. He was probably my age, maybe a few years younger, and he looked fit, confident. He looked like the kind of man who got what he wanted. I felt a surge of something hot and violent in my chest. I wanted to storm in there, to flip the table over, to demand to know who this man was and what he was doing with my wife. I wanted to see the look on her face when she saw me. But my feet felt nailed to the pavement. The architect in me, the planner, the man who thinks before he acts, took over. A public scene would give her the advantage. It would make me the hysterical husband, the villain of the piece. She could twist it, turn it into a story of my jealousy, my lack of trust. No, I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. With a monumental effort of will, I turned and walked away. I walked back to the parking garage, my movements stiff and robotic. I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes after a massive explosion when the dust is settling. The initial shock had given way to a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a betrayal. The lie about the ride, the car in the garage, the committee dinner. It was all a flimsy cover for this. For him. I got in my car and just sat there in the semi-darkness of the concrete garage. My hands were shaking. I looked at my phone. It was 9:15. I thought about her text message. Running a little late. Maybe closer to 10 now. She was buying more time with him. The thought was a physical blow. How long had this been going on? The ease between them, the casual intimacy. That wasn't new. That was practiced. Comfortable. This wasn't their first dinner. How many other nights had I been at the office, working to pay for this life, while she was living another one? My mind reeled back through the past year. The frequent late nights with the girls, the weekend charity retreats, the sudden, intense interest she developed in art gallery openings, events I always found tedious and begged off attending. Every excuse, every white lie, now looked like a brick in a wall she had been building between us. And I had been too busy, too trusting, too stupid to see it. At 9:55, my phone rang. It was her. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, schooling my voice to sound normal, a little tired. "Hey," I said. "Hi, honey. We're just finishing up. I can be out front in 5 minutes. Are you close?" Her voice was the same as it had been hours ago. Cheerful, carefree. The performance was flawless. "Yeah, I'm just around the corner," I lied. "I'll be there in 5. "Great. See you in a minute. You're the best." She hung up. I started the car and drove out of the garage. I circled the block slowly, giving her time to say her goodbyes. I imagined the scene. A quick, furtive kiss in the restaurant's vestibule. A promise to call tomorrow. The images were like acid in my brain. When I pulled up to the curb in front of Aria, she was standing there, waiting. She had her coat on, her purse clutched in her hand. She looked beautiful under the warm glow of the restaurant's lights. As she opened the car door and slid in, she brought a gust of cold air and the faint scent of an expensive perfume I didn't recognize. "Oh, thank you," she said, leaning over to give me a quick, dry peck on the cheek. You saved my life. That meeting was endless. I just nodded, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I pulled away from the curb, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I couldn't look at her. How was it? I asked, my voice flat. Oh, the usual. Debating invitation fonts for 3 hours, she said with a light, dismissive laugh. You would have been bored to tears. How was your night? Did you get much work done? Some, I said. It was a quiet evening. The rest of the drive home was filled with her chatter. She talked about the foundation, about Sharon's latest drama, about a ridiculously expensive centerpiece someone had proposed for the gala. She was filling the space, creating a smokescreen of normalcy. I just drove, making non-committal sounds. Uh-huh. Right. Wow. Whenever she paused. Each word she spoke was a lie. Her entire presence in the car next to me felt like a lie. I was driving a stranger home, a very talented actress who had been playing the part of my wife for God knows how long. When we pulled into our driveway, the house was dark, just as I'd left it. Oh, you must have been working so hard you forgot to leave a light on, she said, her voice full of feigned sympathy. I didn't answer. I just killed the engine and sat there in the sudden, profound silence. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. Mark, she said, her voice losing a little of its cheer. Is everything okay? You're being awfully quiet. I finally turned to look at her. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see the faint lines of concern on her face. It was a good performance, a very good one. But I wasn't the audience anymore. I was the critic, and I knew the play was a farce. I'm just tired, Sarah, I said, my voice empty of all emotion. It's been a long day. I got out of the car and walked into the house, leaving her to follow. I didn't look back. That night, for the first time in our marriage, I didn't sleep in our bed. I went into the guest room, closed the door, and locked it. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and I began to plan. The trust was gone. The love, I feared, was gone too. All that was left was the truth, and I was going to find all of it, no matter how much it hurt. My life as I knew it was over. A new, colder, more calculating life had just begun. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. I was living in a fog of surreal duplicity. On the outside, I maintained the facade. I went to work. I came home. I sat at the dinner table with Sarah and listened to her talk about her day. I played the part of the husband, the man I had been just a week before. But on the inside, I was a different person. I was a man on a mission, an investigator in my own life. Every spare moment was dedicated to uncovering the full extent of Sarah's betrayal. My office became my command center. The late nights I had once spent designing buildings for other people, I now spent dissecting the architecture of my own ruin. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. I found a man named Bill, a retired cop with a small, discreet office in a nondescript building on the other side of town. He was a quiet, methodical man with weary eyes that had seen everything. He didn't ask personal questions. He just listened, took notes, and told me his rates. I want to know everything, I told him, my voice low and steady. Who the man is, how long it's been going on, where they meet, everything. I slid an envelope across his desk with a retainer and cash. His name was Richard Maxwell. I gave him the little information I had. Bill just nodded. I'll be in touch, he said. While Bill handled the surveillance, I turned my attention to the one area I suspected was as compromised as our marriage. our finances. For our entire marriage, I had been the primary earner, but Sarah had managed the household accounts. I'd seen it as a partnership, a division of labor. I made the money. She managed its flow. It was easier that way. It let me focus on the business. What a fool I'd been. I started by logging into our joint accounts online, something I hadn't done in years. At first glance, everything looked normal. The mortgage was paid, the utility bills were current, there were regular transfers to our savings. But I started digging deeper, going back month by month, then year by year. I noticed a pattern. Every month, a significant four-figure sum was being transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The description was always vague. Consulting fee or investment services. Then there was the business she'd started 3 years ago, a boutique interior design consultancy she ran for fun. I had been so proud of her. I'd given her the seed money to start it, $100,000 from my own business profits. I saw it as an investment in her happiness. Now, I looked at her business with new, suspicious eyes. I did a corporate search online. Her company, Serene Spaces LLC, was registered to a P.O. box. The list of company officers was public information. There were 2 names, Sarah Connors, President, and Richard Maxwell, Vice President. The screen blurred in front of my eyes. My breath hitched. He wasn't just her lover. He was her business partner. My money, the money I had worked 60-hour weeks to earn, had funded their little venture. The rage that filled me was cold and pure. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of that first night. It was a slow burning fire, deep and consuming. I felt like a man who had woken up to find his house being dismantled around him, beam by beam, by the very people he trusted to hold it up. The calls from Bill started coming in a few days later. He was efficient, detached. He sent me password-protected emails with photos and reports. The first set of photos was from a coffee shop. Sarah and Richard sitting close together, laughing. The next was of them leaving a hotel in the middle of a weekday afternoon. They weren't holding hands, but they walked with the easy familiarity of a long-term couple. Each photo was a fresh stab of pain, but I forced myself to look at them, to absorb the reality they represented. I saved them all to a secure folder on a thumb drive that I kept locked in my desk drawer. Living at home was torture. I had to pretend that nothing was wrong. Sarah seemed to notice my withdrawal, but she attributed it to work stress. "You're working too hard, honey," she'd say, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch felt like a brand. I had to fight the urge to flinch away from her. "Maybe we should take a vacation after the holidays, just the 2 of us." "Maybe," I'd reply, my voice a hollow echo of what it once was. A vacation. The irony was suffocating. One evening, Jake came over for dinner. He slouched at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. "So, Dad," he said, not looking up. "My car's been making a weird noise. I think it's time for an upgrade. The new Explorers look pretty sweet." I looked at this young man, this boy I had raised, who I thought was my son. I had taught him to ride a bike, to throw a baseball. I had sat through terrible school plays and cheered at his graduation. And now, all I saw was a stranger with his mother's sense of entitlement. "The car you have is less than 2 years old, Jake," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Sarah jumped in immediately, her tone light and placating. "Now, Mark, he's a young man trying to establish himself. It's important he has reliable transportation. We can look at the numbers." "We can look at the numbers," I repeated, my eyes locking with hers. What numbers would those be, Sarah? The ones from our joint account, or the ones from your very successful business? A flicker of something, fear, panic, crossed her face before it was replaced by a mask of indignation. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. I work hard on my business. You know that. I'm beginning to understand just how hard you work, I said quietly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake finally looked up from his phone, a frown on his face. What's with you two? Geez. He was annoyed, as if our discord was a personal inconvenience, an unpleasant television show he was being forced to watch. Later that week, Bill the investigator called me. I've got something you need to see, he said, his voice grim. It's not a photo. I met him in a quiet corner of a sterile coffee shop. He slid a plain manila envelope across the table. Inside were bank statements, not from our joint account, but from the Serene Spaces LLC account. Bill had his sources. The statements showed my initial $100,000 investment. From there, I could see the monthly consulting fees from my own account flowing in. But the money wasn't being used for fabric swatches and furniture catalogs. Large sums were being transferred out to another account under the name RM Holdings, Richard Maxwell Holdings. And there were other expenses. Charges for 5-star hotels in cities we'd never visited together, jewelry stores, extravagant dinners at places like Aria. But the most damning discovery was at the bottom of the pile. It was a preliminary application for a mortgage, for a multi-million-dollar condo downtown. The applicants were listed as Sarah Connors and Richard Maxwell. They were planning a life together. They were building a new nest, funded with the spoils of my life's work. They weren't just stealing my money. They were stealing my future and using my past to pay for it. I sat there in that anonymous coffee shop, the papers trembling in my hand, and I felt something inside me break. The grief, the anger, it all collapsed into a vast, empty void. This wasn't just an affair. This was a long con. A carefully orchestrated campaign of deception and theft perpetrated by my wife and her partner. And my son, my own son, was either oblivious or, worse, a willing participant in the benefits of their scheme. I thought about confronting her right then, marching home, throwing the papers in her face, and watching her perfect world crumble. But the planner in me, the cold, calculating man I was becoming, held me back. A messy confrontation was what they would expect. It would be emotional, chaotic. It wouldn't be enough. They had systematically dismantled my life for their own gain. I wouldn't just expose them, I would dismantle theirs. I drove back to my office, the manila envelope on the seat beside me like a ticking bomb. I knew what I had to do. The pain was still there, a constant, dull ache behind my ribs. But now, it was mixed with something else. A steely resolve, a desire for justice. Not revenge, not exactly. Justice. They had written a story where I was the fool, the mark. I was about to write a new ending. The holidays were coming up. Christmas, Sarah's favorite time of year. A time for family. It seemed like the perfect setting for the final act of this tragedy. I would play my part. I would be the loving husband, the doting father. And I would gather my evidence, piece by piece, until I had an arsenal. And then, when they were at their most comfortable, at their most celebratory, I would show them what it truly felt like to have the foundations of your life ripped out from under you. The discovery of the financial conspiracy was a body blow, but the knockout punch was yet to come. It arrived in a way I never could have anticipated, not in a million years. It started with a casual comment from Bill during one of our brief, grim phone calls. He had been tailing Richard Maxwell and had run a deep background check on him. "Funny thing about this Maxwell guy," Bill said, his voice flat and professional. "He was married before, lived in Ohio about 20 years ago. Wife died. Cancer, I think. He had a kid, a son." "Okay," I said, not understanding the relevance. "The thing is," Bill continued, "after the wife passed, the kid went to live with his maternal grandparents. Maxwell, he just took off, started fresh. According to the records, he hasn't had any contact with the son in almost 2 decades. A man who would abandon his own child." It solidified the picture I had of Richard Maxwell. A man with no conscience, no loyalty. But it was just another detail in a sea of damning information. I filed it away and didn't think much more of it. My focus was on the evidence. I spent my nights meticulously documenting everything. I printed out the bank statements showing the transfers. I downloaded the corporate filings for Serene Spaces LLC. I got copies of the credit card bills with the charges for hotels and jewelry. I made a separate file for the PI's photos. My desk drawer looked like a prosecutor's office preparing for a major trial. Amidst this methodical gathering of proof, I was still living the lie at home. The proximity to Sarah was a unique form of torture. I'd watch her on the phone, laughing and murmuring, and I'd know she was talking to him. I'd see her smile, and I'd know it was for a future that didn't include me. The most difficult part was Jake. He was around more often as the holidays approached, drawn by the promise of presents and good food. His entitlement seemed to grow with each passing day. He'd complain about the Wi-Fi speed, about the brand of orange juice in the fridge, about the fact that I was always in a bad mood. He saw my quiet grief as a personal affront, an inconvenience to his comfortable existence. One afternoon, I was cleaning out a closet in the den, a task I'd been avoiding for years. It was full of old photo albums, boxes of Jake's school projects, and other relics of a life I now saw as a museum of lies. I was just going to throw it all out, but something made me pause. I opened one of the photo albums from when Jake was a baby. There I was, a younger man with more hair and fewer lines around his eyes. Holding this tiny infant, I looked so proud, so full of love and hope. I felt a pang of that old affection, a ghost of the father I used to be. I flipped through the pages. Baby Jake in the bath. Baby Jake's first steps. Baby Jake covered in spaghetti. And then I saw it. A hospital photo, taken the day he was born. I was there in scrubs, holding him. Sarah was in the hospital bed, looking tired but radiant. And in the corner of the photo, almost out of frame, were Sarah's parents. And next to them was another man. He was younger, with dark hair, and a face I vaguely recognized but couldn't place. He was looking at the baby with an intensity that seemed out of place for a casual friend. My blood ran cold. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. Who was that? Why was he there in the delivery room? I dug through a box of old cards and announcements until I found Jake's birth announcement. It listed the date. October 26th, 23 years ago. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for Richard Maxwell. I found an old article about a real estate deal he'd done in the early 2000s. There was a photo of him. He was younger, leaner, but it was unmistakably him. The man from the hospital photo. The room started to spin. No, it wasn't possible. Sarah and I had been married for 2 years when Jake was born. We were happy, weren't we? I thought back to that time. I had just started my firm. I was working crazy hours. I was stressed, exhausted, trying to build a future for my new family. Sarah had been distant at times. I'd chalked it up to the hormones of pregnancy, the stress of becoming a new mother. I had been so wrapped up in my own world, my own ambitions. Had I missed everything? The thought was too monstrous to contemplate. But it took root in my mind, a poisonous seed that began to sprout with terrifying speed. Bill's words came back to me. He had a kid, a son he abandoned. I looked at the photo again, then at a recent picture of Jake. For the first time, I looked at him not as my son, but as a collection of features. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way his dark hair grew. There was nothing of me in him. Nothing. All these years, I had told myself he just took after Sarah's side of the family. Now I saw the faint, ghostly resemblance to the younger Richard Maxwell in the old photo. I felt like I was going to be sick. This went beyond an affair, beyond financial fraud. This was a betrayal on a biological level, a fundamental deception that rewrote my entire adult life. Was the man I called my son, the boy I had loved and raised and provided for, not mine? Was he the son of the man who was currently sleeping with my wife and stealing my money? The need to know became a physical craving, an obsession that dwarfed everything else. A simple DNA test. That's all it would take to confirm or deny this unspeakable horror. The logistics were sickeningly easy. Jake was always leaving half-empty water bottles and used coffee cups around the house. And I had a hairbrush in my bathroom. The next day, I ordered a paternity testing kit online from a discreet, reputable lab. It arrived a few days later in a plain brown box. Getting the samples was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I waited until Jake had left the main house to go back to his guest house. His used water bottle was on the kitchen counter. My hand shook as I used the swab from the kit to collect saliva from the bottle's rim. I felt like a thief, a spy in my own home. Then I went to my bathroom and pulled a few strands of hair from my brush. I sealed the samples in the provided envelopes, filled out the paperwork with a trembling hand, and drove to a post office in the next town to mail it. The 2 weeks I waited for the results were the longest of my life. Every interaction with Jake was fraught with a new, terrible weight. I'd look at him and see a ghost. I'd hear his voice and wonder if I was hearing echoes of another man. The love I'd felt for him, which had already been strained by his behavior, was curdling into something I couldn't name. It was a complex cocktail of pity, resentment, and a profound, bottomless grief for the son I thought I had. The email arrived on a Thursday morning. The subject line was clinical. Your test results are ready. I was in my office. I closed the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clicked the link and entered my case number and password. The report loaded on my screen. It was a simple table of genetic markers, a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me. But at the bottom, in clear, unambiguous text, was the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 0% 0. The word was absolute, final. It was a door slamming shut on 23 years of my life. I stared at the screen, the two words burning into my retinas. 0%. I was not his father. Jake was not my son. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my computer against the wall. A strange, terrifying calm descended over me. It was the calm of a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to fear. The pain was so immense, so all-encompassing, that it became a kind of numbness. I finally understood. My entire marriage, my entire family, was a lie from the very beginning. Sarah hadn't just cheated on me recently. She had started our life together with the ultimate deception. She had passed another man's child off as my own and let me raise him, love him, and pay for him for more than 2 decades. This changed everything. The plan I had been forming, the one centered on financial justice, now seemed inadequate. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about my life, my identity. They hadn't just taken my money. They had taken my legacy. They had made a mockery of my fatherhood. I printed the DNA report and added it to the manila envelope. It was the final, most devastating piece of evidence in my collection. My resolve hardened from steel into diamond. The Christmas dinner I had been planning would not just be a financial reckoning. It would be an existential one. I would not just reclaim my assets. I would reclaim my life. I would expose every single lie, from the very first one to the very last. And I would watch as the family I had built, which I now knew was a house of cards, came fluttering down around them. The man who walked out of my office that day was not Mark Connors, the successful architect and family man. He was a stranger, a man hollowed out and remade by a truth so profound it had burned away everything he once was. The period between getting the DNA results and Christmas was like living underwater. The world moved slowly, its sounds muffled and distant. My grief and rage had coalesced into a single, cold point of focus: the plan. My work as an architect had taught me the importance of precision, of having a solid foundation before you begin to build. Now, I was applying those same principles to a demolition. My first call was to my lawyer, David. He was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had handled my business contracts for years. I met him in his office, a space of dark wood and leather-bound books that smelled of authority. I laid out the manila envelope on his polished mahogany desk. "I need to understand my position, David," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "And I need to secure everything that is mine." I walked him through the story, starting with the restaurant and ending with the DNA report. I watched his face as he absorbed the details. His professional composure never slipped, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity, maybe, or just sheer disbelief at the audacity of the deception. He read through the documents I'd brought: the bank statements, the corporate filings for Serene Spaces, the mortgage application, the photos, and finally, the paternity test. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He was silent for a full minute. "Mark," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm, "this is comprehensive. This isn't just a divorce case. This is fraud on a significant scale." He explained the legal landscape to me. The state we lived in was a no-fault divorce state, but the financial infidelity and fraud were another matter entirely. The fact that I could prove my initial investment in Sarah's company was being funneled directly to her lover for their personal use was a powerful weapon. But the most significant factor, he explained, was how our assets were structured. Years ago, on David's advice, I had placed my architectural firm and the bulk of my investment portfolio into an irrevocable trust. It was a standard asset protection strategy, meant to shield my personal wealth from any potential business liabilities. The primary beneficiary of that trust was me. Sarah was a secondary, contingent beneficiary, only in the event of my death. She had signed the papers at the time, barely glancing at them, thinking it was just boring business stuff. She had no idea that this legal structure, which I'd set up to protect our family, would become my fortress. Our house was a different matter. It was in both our names. But David had an idea. He pointed to the bank statements from Serene Spaces. "They applied for a mortgage," he said. "They needed a down payment. Where did they get it?" It was a question I hadn't considered. We spent the next hour poring over the statements, tracing the flow of money. We found it. a series of large withdrawals from the Serene Spaces account in the weeks leading up to their mortgage application, totaling nearly $200,000. Money that originated from me. David's eyes lit up. "We can put a lien on their new property before they even close on it," he said. "But there's a better way to handle the house you're in now. A more direct approach." The plan he outlined was brilliant in its simplicity. I would offer to buy out Sarah's half of the house. I would present it as a gesture of goodwill, a way to free up cash for her struggling business. We would use an inflated valuation, making the offer seem incredibly generous. The money for the buyout would come from our joint savings account, an account that was technically half hers anyway. She would be so focused on the cash, on the final puzzle piece for her new life with Richard, that she wouldn't see the trap. She would gladly sign a quitclaim deed, transferring the house fully into my name. She'd think she was winning, getting a huge cash payout and the freedom to leave. In reality, she'd be selling her stake in a multi-million-dollar asset for a fraction of its worth, using her own share of our savings to do it. The paternity issue was more complex. Legally, after 23 years, I was Jake's father in the eyes of the law. I had parental rights and responsibilities. "You could fight it," David said. "Demand Maxwell pay back child support for 23 years. It would be a messy, public battle." "No," I said immediately. "I don't want a cent from that man, and I don't want a public spectacle. This is a private matter. It's my leverage." David nodded, understanding. The DNA report wasn't a legal tool for financial gain. It was the emotional checkmate. I left his office feeling empowered for the first time in months. I had a roadmap. The next few weeks were a blur of calculated moves. I met with my financial advisor and, following David's instructions, began the process of quietly moving funds, securing accounts, and ensuring that everything tied to the irrevocable trust was ironclad. Then came the conversation with Sarah about the house. I chose a Sunday morning, a time that was usually relaxed. I made coffee. I put on a calm, reasonable demeanor. "Sarah," I began, "we need to talk. I'm worried about you. I know the business has been a struggle, and I see the stress it's putting on you." She looked at me, her eyes wary. "It's fine, Mark. It's just the usual growing pains." "I want to help," I said, my voice full of fake sincerity. "I was thinking, this house is too big for us now anyway. What if I bought you out? We could get it appraised, and I'll give you your full half in cash. It would give your business the capital injection it needs, and you wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep here." I saw the flicker of avarice in her eyes, the quick calculation. I had dangled the perfect bait. The money. The final piece she and Richard needed to secure their new condo and their new life. She was trying to hide her excitement, putting on a show of reluctance. "Oh, Mark, I don't know. This is our home. We have so many memories here." "I know," I said, my heart a block of ice. "But we have to be practical. This is the best way I can support your dream." It took a few days of feigned negotiation, but she agreed. As I predicted, she pushed for a high valuation, and I readily accepted. The paperwork was drawn up by David. The day we went to the bank to sign the documents, she was giddy, practically vibrating with suppressed triumph. She thought she was pulling off the deal of a lifetime. As she signed the quitclaim deed, transferring our family home solely to me, she had a smug little smile on her face. She had no idea she was signing her own eviction notice. With the finances secured and the house in my name, all that was left was to wait. I had to endure Thanksgiving, a tense, miserable affair where I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the woman who had betrayed me and the young man who was a living symbol of that betrayal. I carved the turkey. I proposed a toast to family and health. The hypocrisy tasted like ash in my mouth. As Christmas approached, Sarah went into overdrive. The house was decorated to within an inch of its life. A massive tree dripping with ornaments and lights stood in the living room. Wreaths with big red bows hung on every door. She was curating the perfect family Christmas, the final scene of the play before she made her exit. She and Jake went on massive shopping sprees, buying lavish gifts for everyone, including me. They bought me a ridiculously expensive watch, which I knew was purchased with the money I had just given her for the house. The audacity was breathtaking. I played my part. I feigned enthusiasm over the decorations. I wrapped the presents I'd bought. I was an actor in the final, farcical act of my own life. But underneath the placid surface, I was counting down the days. I had my folder of documents locked in my briefcase. Every piece of paper was a weapon, sharpened and ready. Christmas Eve arrived. The house was filled with the smell of pine and baking cookies. Carols played softly from a speaker in the corner. It was the picture of domestic bliss, a perfect holiday scene. But I saw it for what it was. A beautifully decorated mausoleum, a tomb for a family that had never really existed. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life. Tomorrow, I thought to myself, as I watched Sarah place the last of the presents under the tree. Tomorrow, the movie ends. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, the sunlight glittering on the frost-covered lawn. From my window in the guest room, the world looked peaceful, pristine. It was the kind of Christmas morning you see in advertisements, a perfect snow globe version of reality. But inside the house, the air was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of all the lies I now carried. I had barely slept. I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the last 23 years, viewing them through the new, harsh lens of the truth. Every memory was tainted. Every happy moment was called into question. Had she ever loved me? Or had I always been a means to an end? A stable, reliable provider who could give her and her real loved son a comfortable life? The question circled in my head, vultures over a fresh kill. I finally got up and dressed, putting on the clothes of a man I no longer was. A nice sweater, comfortable slacks, the uniform of a suburban father on Christmas morning. When I came downstairs, the scene was one of overwhelming, aggressive festivity. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming along to White Christmas, wearing a festive red apron over her silk pajamas. The aroma of cinnamon rolls and coffee filled the air. Jake was already by the tree, phone in hand, of course, but looking at the mountain of gifts with a greedy glint in his eye. "Merry Christmas, sleepyhead," Sarah chirped, turning to smile at me. It was a brilliant, dazzling smile, a performer's smile. "Coffee's fresh." "Merry Christmas," I mumbled, pouring myself a cup. My hand was steady. I was surprised by my own composure. The emotional storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a cold, desolate calm. I was an observer now, a man waiting for the curtain to rise. We went through the motions of opening gifts. It was a grotesque parody of every Christmas we'd ever had. Jake tore through his presents with practiced efficiency, tossing aside wrapping paper to reveal a new gaming console, designer clothes, and the keys to a new tablet. He'd offer a cursory "thanks" before moving on to the next box. Sarah opened her gifts from me, a cashmere scarf, a set of expensive perfumes I'd bought on autopilot weeks ago, with effusive, theatrical delight. "Oh, Mark, it's beautiful. You know me so well." The lie of it, the sheer, brazen falsehood, was so profound it was almost sublime. I knew that in her purse was a phone filled with texts from Richard Maxwell. I knew that in her mind, she was already living in their new condo, decorating it with the money she thought she'd swindled from me. Then it was my turn. Jake handed me a small, heavy box. "This is from me and Mom," he said. I opened it. Inside was the watch I'd seen them shopping for. A sleek, silver monstrosity with a price tag that could have funded a small business. I looked at it, lying on its velvet cushion. It felt like a prop, a final, insulting payment for my services. "Wow," I said, my voice flat. "It's a lot." "It's the best, Dad," Jake said, puffing out his chest slightly. "You deserve it. For all your hard work." I just nodded, setting the box aside. The hard work. He had no idea. The rest of the morning passed in a slow-motion haze. Sarah's parents, Eleanor and George, were due to arrive for dinner around 3. They were pleasant, unremarkable people who had always treated me with a kind of benign neglect. I wondered, as I set the table with the good china, how much they knew. Were they complicit in their daughter's decades-long deception? Or were they just as blind as I had been? As I placed the forks and knives, my mind drifted to the folder in my briefcase upstairs. I had arranged the documents in a specific order. A narrative. It started with the photos of Sarah and Richard. Then the financial statements from Serene Spaces. Then the documents showing the transfer of my $100,000 investment into their personal slush fund. Then the quitclaim deed for the house, signed by Sarah. And at the very bottom, the pièce d'resistance, the DNA report. Each page was a nail in the coffin of the life we had pretended to live. Sarah was in the kitchen, basting the turkey. The smell, which usually meant family and celebration, now smelled like a funeral. She was in her element, the perfect hostess, orchestrating the perfect holiday meal. She called out instructions to Jake, who was grudgingly mashing potatoes. The scene was so painfully, beautifully normal, a snapshot of the American dream. And I was about to shatter it into a million pieces. I felt a moment of doubt, a flicker of the old me. Was this necessary? Couldn't I just file for divorce quietly, walk away with my assets and my dignity? But then I looked at Jake, complaining that the potato masher was giving him a blister. I looked at Sarah, humming a Christmas carol as she arranged cranberries on a platter. They were so comfortable in their lies, so secure in the world I had built for them, a world they were preparing to discard me from as soon as they had extracted every last drop of value. No, a quiet departure wasn't justice. It was surrender. They needed to see the full, unvarnished truth. They needed to understand the wreckage they had caused. Eleanor and George arrived right on time, bundled in coats and scarves, their arms full of professionally wrapped gifts. They kissed Sarah, shook Jake's hand, and gave me a polite, watery smile. "Mark, you look tired," Eleanor said, her brow furrowed with what passed for concern. "Sarah tells us you've been working yourself to the bone." "Something like that," I said. We made small talk in the living room. George talked about his golf game. Eleanor complimented the decorations. Sarah flitted about, offering drinks and appetizers. The gracious lady of the manor, Jake showed off his new gaming console to his grandfather, who looked at it with complete bewilderment. I just sat in my armchair, nursing a glass of sparkling water, and watched them. I felt utterly detached, like a ghost at my own feast. Finally, Sarah announced that dinner was ready. We all moved to the dining room. The table was a masterpiece of holiday splendor. A festive runner, candles, a floral centerpiece. The turkey, golden brown and glistening, sat on a platter in the center. It looked like the cover of a magazine. We took our seats. I was at the head of the table, the traditional place of the patriarch. Sarah was at the other end, beaming with pride. Her parents were on one side, Jake on the other. For a few minutes, there was just the sound of serving spoons clinking against china as we filled our plates. "Well," George said, raising his glass, "a toast to family and to Sarah for another magnificent meal." We all raised our glasses. "To family," everyone echoed. I touched the rim of my glass to my lips, the water tasteless in my mouth. The meal began. The conversation was light, meaningless. The weather, a neighbor's gaudy Christmas lights, Jake's vague plans for the future. I ate without tasting anything, my focus entirely on the briefcase upstairs. I was just waiting for the right moment, the moment they provided me. And I had a feeling I wouldn't have to wait very long. The tension was building, a low hum beneath the cheerful chatter. The storm was coming, and I was the one holding the lightning. The small talk eventually died down, replaced by the comfortable sounds of eating. The candles on the table flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the sky had darkened to a deep, velvety blue. The scene was peaceful, domestic. It was the calm before the storm. I knew it was time. But before I could speak, Jake cleared his throat, setting down his fork with a decisive clatter. He had an announcement to make. He looked around the table, a smug, self-important expression on his face. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. This was rehearsed. This was part of their plan. "So," Jake began, his voice loud in the sudden silence, "we, as a family, have been talking." He gestured between himself and Sarah. "And we've made a decision about the future." Eleanor and George looked on with placid curiosity. I just watched him, my face a mask of neutrality. He turned his gaze directly to me. There was no warmth in his eyes, no hint of the affection a son should have for a father. There was only a cold, dismissive arrogance. "Dad," he barked, the word sharp and disrespectful. "The family has decided we don't need you anymore." The words hung in the air, brutal and absolute. Eleanor gasped. George looked confused, but Sarah just sat there, her expression carefully neutral, letting her son be the executioner. "It's time for a change," Jake continued, warming to his theme. "Mom has her own life now, her own successful business. I'm an adult. We're moving on. You've been great. You provided, you built this house. But your part in the story's over. We'll be selling the house, of course. Mom will give you a fair share so you can find a small apartment or something. It's for the best. A clean break." He sat back, looking proud of himself, as if he had just delivered a brilliant corporate presentation. He expected me to argue, to get angry, to plead. He expected a scene. I did none of those things. I simply looked at him, a deep, profound sadness washing over me, erasing the last vestiges of the love I once had. He wasn't just a stranger to me. He was a weapon that had been fashioned and aimed at my heart from the moment of his conception. I nodded slowly. "I see," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "If that's the family's decision." I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Then I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Then this is yours." I walked out of the dining room, leaving them in a stunned silence. I went upstairs to my office and retrieved my briefcase. I walked back down and placed it on the dining table with a soft thud. I clicked open the latches and pulled out the thick manila folder. Their eyes were all on me, a mixture of confusion, annoyance, and, from Sarah, a dawning flicker of fear. "You're right, Jake," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. It is time for a change. And you're right, Sarah has a very successful business. I pulled out the first document and slid it across the table toward her. It was the corporate filing for Serene Spaces LLC, with her name and Richard Maxwell's name listed as officers. A business I funded with a $100,000 gift, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I slid the next document over, the bank statement showing the transfer from my account, and a business that my monthly consulting fees have been supporting for years. I added the stack of our joint account statements showing the transfers. Sarah's face had gone pale. Mark, what is this? This is private business information. Oh, it's all about to become very public? I said calmly. I pulled out the photos, the ones of her and Richard at the coffee shop, the ones of them leaving the hotel. I fanned them out on the table like a losing poker hand that had suddenly become a royal flush. Eleanor let out a little squeak. George's mouth hung open. Jake stared at the photos, his arrogant smirk melting into confusion. And it seems to be a very personal business, I added. I then laid down the copies of the Serene Spaces bank statements. I had highlighted the expenditures. Charges for hotels, jewelry, expensive dinners at Aria on nights you were supposedly at charity meetings. Sarah was speechless, her face a mask of horror. She looked like a cornered animal. But the biggest expense, I said, my voice dropping, was the nearly $200,000 you transferred to a holding company owned by Mr. Maxwell. I assume that was for the down payment on your new condo? I added their mortgage application to the pile. Jake finally found his voice. Mom, what is this? What's he talking about? He stammered, looking from the papers to his mother's ashen face. And as for selling this house, I said, turning my attention back to my wife, I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, when you so cleverly got me to buy you out last month, you signed a quitclaim deed. I placed the deed on the very top of the pile. It was the final document from our transaction, showing my name as the sole owner. This house is mine, 100%. You, on the other hand, have a check for $200,000 of what was essentially our shared money, and no legal claim to this property whatsoever. In fact, you are now trespassing. Sarah started to hyperventilate, her hand at her throat. You can't do this. Oh, I can, I said. I looked at Jake. And you say the family has decided, but you've never been a part of this family. Not really. I reached into the folder and pulled out the last piece of paper. The DNA report. I didn't slide it over. I held it up. You see, I did some research about your mother's business partner, Richard Maxwell, a man she has known for a very, very long time. A man who, 23 years ago, was in the delivery room when you were born. I tossed the paper onto the center of the table. It landed face up. The words were stark against the white page. Probability of paternity, 0%. Jake stared at it. His face went from pale to ghostly white. He looked at the paper, then at his mother, then back at the paper. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He finally picked it up, his hand shaking violently. He read the words, and a sound tore from his throat, a raw, agonized scream that was part rage, part grief, part sheer, unadulterated horror. It was the sound of a world collapsing. He leapt to his feet, knocking his chair over. He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. You lied to me. My whole life. You lied, he shrieked, his voice cracking. Sarah just sobbed, her head in her hands. Eleanor and George were frozen, their faces etched with shock and shame. I looked at the chaos I had unleashed, at the wreckage of the family I had poured my life into. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast, hollow emptiness. I had won. I had gotten my justice. But the price was the last 23 years of my life. I turned and walked away from the table, away from the screaming and the crying. I didn't look back. I went to the front door, put on my coat, and picked up a small overnight bag I had packed earlier. As I opened the door to the cold night air, I paused and spoke without turning around, my voice clear and final. I'll have my lawyers send you a list of times when you can come and collect your personal belongings. You have 48 hours to vacate the guest house, Jake. Sarah, your things will be boxed up. Don't try to contact me. I stepped out into the night and closed the door behind me, shutting out the sounds of their destruction. I walked down the path, the crisp air feeling clean and new in my lungs. I didn't know where I was going, not really. But for the first time in a very long time, I was walking toward a future that was truly my own. A future built not on lies, but on a hard, painful, and liberating truth. The house I built still stood behind me, but the home was gone, and I was finally free.